A towering circular structure looming over hidden underground tunnels.
It has a very mysterious, kind of otherworldly feel to it. Clearly, something top secret was going on here.
A seemingly endless concrete line stretching through the French countryside.
It looks modern and ancient at the same time, almost like it's some sort of a ruin from the future.
A building with a decorative exterior that was constructed for a macabre purpose.
On the inside, it actually had a really sinister purpose. You'd never guess that just by looking at its facade.
And a small facility near London with a secret Cold War past.
This is clearly a place someone has built out of fear.
These extraordinary buildings and structures once helped shape the course of history. Some led the way in design and construction, but now they lie abandoned, derelict, and crumbling. Who built them and how? And why were they abandoned? In the southwest of Poland, close to the border with the Czech Republic, are the remains of a structure that's challenging established history.
Seemingly out of nowhere, you see this large circular structure. It's almost like aliens have just dropped this from the sky.
What is this thing? What's it doing here? And you know what? Something about it tells me there's more than meets the eye.
It's certainly a striking feature of these hills. But it's not the only decaying structure to be found here.
You see there's lots of other buildings nearby. And more importantly, you see they've dug and created tunnels underground. You wouldn't build a site like this here for convenience. You'd build it for secrecy.
So, what was it all for? And what dark secrets might it be hiding? A host of extraordinary stories and tales surround this place. Most stem from the later years of the Second World War, when the area was a hive of secret Nazi activity.
The structure has been built in a remote location miles from any cities. It's up in the mountains, there's dense woods. It's out of reach of the Allies, and I think that's the important point.
As the Allied bombing of Poland became more intense, the Nazis moved their weapons and research facilities to remote locations, taking care to camouflage the new sites as they built them. Sheltered beneath the trees, this was once a sprawling secret facility. Just one of many in this heavily defended region.
On the ground, you would have different defenses consisting of bunkers, machine gun posts, anti-tank posts. It would be the kind of defenses that would take up probably several thousand men to protect.
In these hills, this 100 feet wide monument stands alone. Some believe it's simply the remnants of a cooling tower which was built for a nearby power plant. But others, such as Igor Witkowski, think that it was something far more sinister, and was perhaps even linked to futuristic technology.
In the very center of this valley, we find such a strange structure visible here. It's a concrete ring, 32 meters in diameter, with very massive columns. It was built in such a strong way, with strong, thick reinforcement rods, that it is clear that it was built to withstand really great forces.
Igor believes this concrete circle was once a key part of the Nazi plan to conquer the world.
I have found a similarity to test rigs used in the modern times for testing helicopters, only that this is much larger. Then one may suspect that it might have been used to test some really large flying objects.
The structure is known as the Henge. But what could those strange flying objects have been?
One possible theory as to the purpose of this site is that it was a test facility for the development of the Germans' last great hope to win the war, the Wunderwaffe, or miracle weapon.
One of the most menacing wartime developments was the V2 rocket program.
Quite a few will hit Britain, and they will cause a lot of devastation.
The V2 rocket was seen as Hitler's last throw of the dice. The V stood for vengeance, and it was developed to avenge the devastating Allied air attacks on German cities. Unlike the V1 rocket, which was better known by its popular name, the Doodlebug, the V2 was a deadly guided ballistic missile which had a maximum speed of almost 4,000 miles per hour. It arrived at its target without warning. More than 1,400 were fired at Britain, but it was London and the southeast of England that bore the brunt of the V2 terror. Some 7,000 civilians were killed by them. But some people believe that the Germans were working on a number of other new projects here at the Henge site.
Under the site, we see long, dark, wet tunnels that lead nowhere. Now, we can't see where they go. That's been all blocked off. But it cannot be a coincidence. They lie just below this weird circular structure above ground.
At first sight, there's little here to suggest that they were anything other than empty tunnels. But for those who know where to look, the story is very different.
We are in one of the tunnels connecting the power plant with the underground complex here. And you have these niches here where the high voltage power cables were placed, one above the other. And they give some idea about the size of the entire project. And these cables are the size comparable with a high voltage power line that would power a medium-sized city.
The suspicion is that even deeper below, the Nazis had commandeered a vast former mining network.
All these signs of unusual secrecy that we can see in this valley are only an introduction to the main part of the complex, which is inaccessible today.
Around 1944, there were reports surfacing of these advanced flying objects called Foo Fighters, who were seen by the Allied pilots. These singular balls of light that were streaking in the air around the plane, only faster than the plane.
One theory is that a top-secret technology called Die Glocke, which translates as the bell, was being developed. The aim was to create a new vertical takeoff aircraft, and the Henge was to be the final test site.
The theory of the bell goes something like this. Two large spinning discs inside a cylindrical shell, and it was the spinning of these discs, possibly fueled by some kind of radioactive material, that enabled the vertical lift.
Later military tests by the USA of alternative aircraft were never successful. But had the Nazis ever cracked it, in theory, they would have been able to develop a machine capable of outmaneuvering and outpacing any aircraft in the world.
We know for some time that there is a link between electromagnetism and gravity and anti-gravity. But exploiting this new phenomena would have been probably the greatest leap in human history, because it would have been something that would have changed the world.
Whether this was to be used in flying craft or flying bombs is unclear, but it does make you wonder if something extraordinary was in the pipeline, and had it come to fruition, might the course of the war been different?
Any hard clues about the work carried out here are all but gone. And as the Nazis retreated at the end of the war, they made sure to cover their tracks, sometimes in the most brutal fashion.
The scientists working on this project here, who might have provided some answers to our questions, they were killed, just in case, to prevent the secret of this place being revealed.
No matter what people say it was used for, there's no denying the number of buildings, the security rings, the trenches, and the fact that it took an incredible amount of effort to create this. All this leads you to the conclusion that something quite big must have been going on here.
Today, all that remains of the Henge site are dark, dank tunnels. And this baffling circular structure.
There is still a great mystery associated with this place that has not been clarified. But in the very center of this mystery is the structure.
On the east coast of China, near the heart of the city of Shanghai, is a building with a bloody past.
This is such an interesting building. It's a huge concrete multi-story structure supported by pillars, but it has all these intricate lattice windows.
From the outside, the design of this building was obviously of real importance to the community, but on the inside, it actually had a really sinister purpose.
A look behind the grand facade is an unsettling experience.
It was almost like a maze of staircases and ramps and structures. Someone really thought hard about the design of this place.
There's sections that are completely isolated, so whatever went on here couldn't see what's going on here. I don't think anyone would guess in a million years what it was originally used for.
So what was the purpose of this mystifying structure? And to where did this labyrinth of passages lead? The fact is that the building was once used as a place of death. But its dramatic story began before the Second World War, during a time of hope and prosperity for Shanghai.
In the 1930s, Shanghai was a place to be. It was referred to as the Paris of the East. Many foreigners keen to do business were flooding into the area.
It had a thriving port, it had an industrial center, and it was a magnet for businessmen who were looking for new ventures.
Shanghai's increasing financial power enabled it to become the commercial hub of East Asia, as banks from all over the world were attracted to the city. Its success was not confined to finance and commerce. The arts also began to thrive, with Chinese music, animation, and cinema in particular all becoming more popular than ever before.
Today, Shanghai's skyline towers with the tallest buildings ever erected outside the United States.
But this low-rise structure is probably the most intriguing of them all. As local expert Patrick Cranley explains.
It's a very complex building that reminds a lot of people of the work of an artist called M.C. Escher, who used three-dimensional illusion to create really fascinating works of art. you almost feel like you're entering into an Escher drawing. You get disoriented, and then you get fascinated. You want to figure out how the building works and where all these ramps and stairways go.
The convoluted layout offers few clues as to what the function of this place really was.
Shanghai was the 6th largest city in the world. It had more than 3 million residents and was growing quickly. And the municipal authorities were taking responsibility for making this a modern city in many ways.
With its colossal size and opulent exterior, this was clearly a building of vital importance. But maybe not in the way expected.
The design of this building is very unusual and really reflects both the creative mind of the designer and the purpose of the building, which was to slaughter animals.
This building is an abattoir, and it's where animals go to die and where meat is produced for a huge populace.
This is the 1933 slaughterhouse. But even on the inside, it doesn't look like one. So how did it work?
The design is very unusual in that it is square, and then inside a round area where work was done.
Linking the two areas were a series of bridges, ramps, and staircases.
The ramps were for the animals, the cattle and the pigs, and the stairways, obviously, for the humans.
Different floors were used to slaughter different animals.
The outer area is where they would keep the animals. The inner sanctum, that was for the killing.
The building had just one sole purpose. Everything in it was designed to make slaughtering animals quicker, easier, and more efficient.
If you think about a slaughterhouse, the smell was probably very, very strong. So the windows allowed lots of air to pass through.
What was really fascinating was the attention to detail. So things like rough surfaces of floors to allow animals to walk, or hollowed out walls for temperature control.
But it wasn't just about keeping the place light and breezy. It was designed to deal with the grim realities of an abattoir.
So these pipes and this trough and the drains are all part of a system of hygiene to drain the blood and other fluids from the slaughtering of the animals.
These were all features that were thought about specifically with the function of the building in mind.
The 1933 slaughterhouse ran like clockwork. Animals were brought up ramps to their designated floor and then kept in the large halls, after which they were led across the bridges to the slaughter hall and into a cage.
The animal was killed by a bolt to the head. Then the cage was tilted so it would slide down naturally to the floor where the butchers would process the meat.
The carcasses were then hung before being transferred into the chilling rooms. It was a finely tuned killing machine which dispatched thousands of animals every day.
It was almost like a reverse manufacturing process. So rather than assembling things, it was designed to disassemble. It's such a sinister function of a space, but in terms of efficiency, it's brilliant.
But although the entire process was ruthless in its efficiency, there were ever-present dangers.
Well, since a large number of cattle were being processed through the facility, it was important to be able to provide safe zones for the workers in case there was a large panic amongst the cattle. So the angular nature of these ramps would prevent a large stampede and allow refuge zones for the workers.
While that danger could be foreseen, there were others that couldn't.
A few years after the building was built, Shanghai dramatically changed.
In 1941, Japanese forces invaded the city. And this place of death became the scene of a different kind of killing.
So this is a cement blockhouse that was used during World War II to protect the canal that brought some of the animals and other materials to this area. So there would be machine guns placed inside, and they'd be protecting both sides of the canal.
Despite years of Japanese occupation and the uncertainties of war, when the fighting stopped and the Japanese left, the slaughterhouse had survived practically unscathed.
In an occupied city during wartime, the future of this building was uncertain. But because it was such a well-designed building, after the war, it continued to function as it was designed for decades.
The slaughterhouse stopped operating in the 1960s, but it remained in use as a cold storage facility and then a medicine factory up until 2002. It was born in Shanghai's boom years during the 30s. It sent millions of animals to their deaths and somehow survived the hell of war. And even today, the slaughterhouse remains an extraordinary-looking building.
It could have been just an afterthought without any aesthetic appeal, but the designer used his creativity to make something very beautiful. But its purpose was rather macabre, that is, to slaughter animals.
And hopefully it can remain around for a long time as a reminder of the historical 1930s Shanghai, as well as a great example of Art Deco architecture.
Near the small town of Chevy in France, just 60 miles south of Paris, there stands a battered concrete platform which stretches out far across the fields.
When you see this rising out of the countryside, it looks modern and ancient at the same time, almost like it's some sort of a ruin from the future.
It's this random structure that looks like it's something industrial, sitting in the middle of the countryside, and it just goes on for miles and miles.
But the line isn't complete.
It makes absolutely no sense. There are 3 separate sections, but yet they don't start or end in any particular place.
When you get closer to it, you see bits of concrete crumbling off it. And then there's a strange ridge that runs through the center of it.
It seems almost Blade Runner-esque, but yet it's in the middle of nowhere and clearly does nothing.
So what was it built for? And where was it supposed to lead? Abandoned for decades, the history of this structure is surrounded by conspiracy theories and rumors of sabotage. But today, it still has its admirers.
The structure doesn't look like much now, but in its day, it was the scene of a revolutionary project that was way ahead of its time.
It was once a continuous track, more than 100 miles in length.
It was an extraordinary project, and it has been a huge inspiration for us. Today, we want to use the engineering of that time, along with today's technology, to create our own transport revolution.
But if it was intended for use in transportation, then what kind? The answer lies in a period of astonishing technological advances.
The 60s was an incredible period for the burgeoning of technology. People were looking to the future in all sorts of ways. There was the space race, Concorde, science blossomed.
While many engineers were looking to the skies, with this design, the ambitions were closer to the ground.
The project was to reinvent rail travel, to replace the train with something much sleeker, much faster.
you would expect it to just be parallel tracks, but what makes it really unusual is this ridge that runs along it, which kind of suggests that there was some kind of innovation involved, some new thinking.
The remnants of that adventurous new technology can be found in a nearby warehouse. It's a strange, futuristic-looking vehicle that was intended to slot on to that concrete ridge. This was to be a key step forward in a new way to travel. This is the Aerotrain test track.
It's an experimental Aerotrain which set a world speed record for trains hitting 233 miles an hour.
The Aerotrain was an incredibly ambitious project. The idea was a train that would be powered by a jet engine strapped to it.
It ran on a cushion of air instead of wheels. You would pump air under the body of the train, and it would lift the train off of the concrete track.
Essentially, the vehicles were flying, hovering. All you need is a few millimeters of distance between the concrete structure and the vehicle.
That allowed very, very low friction travel, theoretically very high speeds.
The idea was the brainchild of engineer Jean Bertin. His first prototype proved the theory worked, and by 1967, he'd built a version capable of a speed of 214 miles per hour.
Initial testing was extremely encouraging, but what they knew they really needed to do was scale it up to the size of a passenger train.
But that wasn't the only issue. Aerotrain had another problem to overcome.
The bigger problem was there was another project in the pipeline, the TGV high-speed train, that in many ways was more practical than the Aerotrain.
The state-owned TGV was a serious rival. The pressure was on for Jean Bertin to come up with something really special. That was the Aerotrain 180. Former pilot Daniel Hermes recalls the experience of taking the latest Aerotrain out for a spin.
Moi, personnellement, en tant que pilote, j'entrais ici dans les locaux.
As the pilot, I entered the offices here to meet the test engineer, who'd then say to me, "This is the plan for today." It was always such a joy. Just after we started the engine, the atmosphere was pure excitement, because we all knew we were about to travel extremely fast and in absolute comfort.
Capable of carrying 80 passengers and reaching speeds of more than 250 miles per hour, it looked like the winning ticket.
The advantage is the Aerotrain weighed only 20 tons. If we compare that to the TGV that weighs 400 tons, you see it accelerates very quickly. This place brings back memories. I can still see myself on the track in the Aerotrain.
When the French government threw its weight behind the Aerotrain, it looked set to be the future of high-speed travel, not only in France, but around the world. But seeing the few remaining tracks today, something clearly went dramatically wrong.
It's very innovative, it's very elegant and cool looking, and yet it's also impractical in certain ways. You have to ask yourself the question, are wheels really such a big problem?
Ultimately, TGV won the race. Then, Aerotrain suffered a great personal tragedy.
The sudden end was a disaster for us, but it was an absolute catastrophe for Jean Bertin. He began to suffer as soon as he knew the Aerotrain was over. We saw this man wither away, and unfortunately, he died a year later in 1975.
But some believe that it wasn't simply the government trying to save the state-owned network. Other forces may have been at work.
Why was it stopped? Because somebody wanted it stopped.
Scientifically, it was proving to be a brand new frontier in the way we would travel. And then, in a few years, that just completely collapsed.
Suspicions that Aerotrain had been the victim of a conspiracy were inflamed by a strange disaster in 1992. It came after the local mayor announced that the Aerotrain hangar would reopen for tourists.
It was all very exciting, but then within a few days, the hangar that was actually housing the train burnt down. What was very mysterious was this was actually the second fire to have occurred.
There is someone somewhere who really wanted this over for good. So the Aerotrain was set on fire. Coincidence?
While the Aerotrain project seemed fated never to succeed, the track may have found a new lease of life with a more modern project called Space Train.
Space Train is a shuttle project, a shuttle that is propelled to around 500 kilometers per hour on a cushion of air. The concept of Aerotrain was very inspiring for our project Space Train. This structure is in a very good condition. We'd like to reuse it to do our first test.
Projects that fail, that don't come to fruition, still add to our human knowledge. They add technological skill. They bring new materials, new ideas that might ultimately affect other fields, other forms of transportation.
In a wooded area 20 miles northeast of London lies an inconspicuous building which was constructed far away from prying eyes.
The first impressions of this site really are nothing surprising. There's a bit of an innocuous tower. You've got a small house nearby. But other than that, nothing really untoward.
Even though it is well cared for, you can just tell that no one has ever called this place home.
This small building, in fact, harbors a big secret.
Once you go through this unobtrusive front entrance, now you realize that you are in a very large kind of operation.
You go into this long underground tunnel that leads into a big underground labyrinth.
You can tell that somebody wanted to come underground and hide something very valuable from something very terrible. This is clearly a place someone has built out of fear.
So what was it that made people build this here, deep underground, near the UK's capital city? The reasons can be found by looking back to the tense early years of the Cold War, when the world had just entered the nuclear age.
1949, Joseph Stalin, who is one of the most ruthless, brutal dictators of history, explodes an atomic bomb. This takes the West by surprise, and this changes the entire game.
The atomic bombs dropped by the Allies on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan in 1945 had finally ended the war in the Pacific. They also increased Stalin's determination to accelerate the Soviet nuclear program, something he did through ruthless intelligence gathering and by using captured German scientists to develop nuclear weapons. The first successful nuclear test came in August 1949 at a secret site in Kazakhstan. The bomb was codenamed First Lightning, and it was based on the US Fat Man plutonium bomb.
President Truman has announced we must now alert the whole world to the peril that this event brings into being.
With fear of a nuclear war growing throughout the world, Facilities like this one sprung up across Britain. But they weren't simply to provide shelter.
During the Second World War, Britain had a network of radar stations to warn of Nazi attack. But once Soviet nuclear attack became a threat, there was a hasty effort to build new ones.
Early warning becomes a top priority during the Cold War.
That signal means to stop whatever you are doing and get to the nearest safe place fast.
Those few minutes of early warning might make the difference between an effective counterstrike, effective survival of your forces or some of your forces, and your national destruction.
Built under a cloak of secrecy, a new radar system named ROTA was established in a network of operations centers around the country, including this one, the Kelvedon Hatch secret nuclear bunker.
During the nuclear weapons testing in the late 1940s, early 1950s, they realized that everything above ground, even a small nuclear weapon, would just devastate everything. It's all gone. However, people could survive if they're underground.
The location itself was somewhat strategic because there was an RAF base nearby, but also the nature of the rock was important because instead of being on soft material like the London clay, this was actually under much harder bedrock.
Covered by more than 13 feet of topsoil, the outer layer of the bunker has a Faraday cage to protect it from stray radio signals. Inside that is a brick skin, a 10 feet thick concrete wall, and 3 operations floors. A 360 feet tunnel leads out to the entrance, which masquerades as a small countryside bungalow.
This was a colossal construction, 27,000 square feet of area, completely hidden. There's about 40,000 tons of concrete that were used to construct the whole thing. A real engineering marvel.
Everyone knew in the 50s that there were Russian spies everywhere. And that meant that it was impossible to keep it a secret that there were command bunkers all over the country, but nobody knew exactly where those bunkers were located.
The site is now owned by farmer Mike Parrish. Mike has become an expert on what went on here, and particularly on the bunker's imminent attack protocol.
We've now got the blast doors here, which, once they're shut, well, everybody will be in here for at least 3 months.
The bunker was able to support up to 600 people. Once they were locked inside, it was these machines that would keep the deadly radiation out.
The air would normally flow into this fan here, which would just pump it straight into the bunker. But if it had become contaminated, then they'd switch that one off and switch the one over there on, which would, in theory, filter all the nasty things out before it actually got inside the bunker itself. So actually, this is what's keeping us all alive.
But while the completed bunker functioned as planned, the new rotor network soon encountered a problem.
Built in less than a year, very, very quick. But interestingly as well, in such a short time, the way that the radars were changing became fairly redundant quite quickly.
Within a few years, there was no longer a need for the rotor control centres. But with its proximity to London and the country's central government, the site would soon have another important role to play in the event of a nuclear attack.
All major powers during the Cold War developed large underground bunkers, facilities that were survivable in case of nuclear attack, and that was to preserve and protect the government. If everything goes wrong, here is a way, at least, that they can maintain some kind of control even in a devastated country afterwards.
By the mid-1980s, Britain had established a new network of regional government headquarters, many of which utilized the former rotor bunkers.
The British government was going to briefly disintegrate when a nuclear attack happened, and all of the cabinet members would be assigned a different region of the country where they would go, and as a minister of the crown would be the most senior person for miles around.
In this worst case scenario, this facility is near London. It would have protected several hundred of the key personnel and enabled them to live for weeks.
With telecommunications linking Kelvedon to other regional headquarters and housing a BBC broadcasting suite to speak to those on the outside, the officer in charge would have played a vital role in coordinating the nation's response. But the first step was to convince the public that there was a real chance of survival.
It was important to government not to let people know just how bad the effects of nuclear war, thermonuclear war, would be. They were afraid that if people really knew what would happen, they would lose hope.
So governments all around the world began to issue advice about what to do in the event of a nuclear attack. But had the bombs ever been dropped, it would have been in rooms like this that the real fight for survival would have played out.
They would be able to plot it on these cold perspex here. The red ones were ground bursts. They produced a lot of radiation because they picked the dirt up, and that's what the threat was, because radiation is carried on dust. There'd be people the other side there who would be able to write backwards, describing where the radiation is flowing. So all the time that information was fed upstairs so that they'd be able to deploy buses and coaches to move the population out of the way of the radiation, if that was indeed possible.
If the worst had happened, the fate of the people and the country would have been in the hands of those working here.
I suspect they would have been very professional and they'd got on with the job. But I know if I was down here and I knew my family was at great risk and the whole world was about to fall apart, my mind wouldn't be 100% on crayoning in which way the wind was blowing.
Although it was primed and ready for action for decades, the site was, thankfully, never needed. When the threat level dropped, the bunker was decommissioned. With Britain never having suffered a nuclear attack, today, Kelvedon might appear to be the very embodiment of Cold War paranoia. But was it?
I don't believe in using the term paranoia when we're talking about the Cold War, because paranoia indicates an irrational fear. And when you're talking about the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin, you're talking about completely sensible, rational fears.
Now they lie abandoned, but once they were at the cutting edge of engineering. There are echoes from history in these decaying structures. They remind us of terror and war, but also of great innovation and human endeavor.